Ex-Nazi medical officer reveals the clinic rooms where female prisoners were harassed before exams, January 17, 1940. Ravensbrück Concentration Camp, northern Germany. The corridor smells of carbolic acid and something else, something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in summer heat. Snow falls outside the barred windows, each flake drifting past iron frames that divide the grey sky into perfect geometric sections. Inside, the linoleum floor gleams under electric bulbs that hum with Prussian efficiency. A woman in a striped uniform walks barefoot down this hallway, her breath visible in the cold. She clutches a thin cotton gown to her chest. Behind her, a female guard in polished boots follows at a measured distance, close enough to remind, far enough to seem civilized. They are moving toward a white door at the corridor's end. On that door, in Gothic script, a single word, Untersuchungszimmer, examination room. The woman's name is Zofia. She's Polish, 23 years old, arrested for hiding Jewish neighbours in her cellar. She has been at Ravensbrück for 11 weeks. In that time, she has learned that certain summons are worse than others. A summons to the quarry means exhaustion. A summons to the punishment block means pain with a clear beginning and end. But a summons to the clinic, the revere, means something that has no proper name in any language she knows. It means the violation of the body in the language of medicine. It means hands in latex gloves and instruments of steel and the particular horror of atrocity dressed as science. She reaches the white door. The guard opens it without knocking. Inside, 3 examination tables with leather restraints, cabinets filled with surgical instruments gleaming like jewellery, a scale, a height chart, bottles of iodine and ether arranged in neat rows, and behind a metal desk, a man in a white coat. Dr. Helmut Vetter, SS Hauptsturmführer, age 37, graduate of the University of Würzburg, member in good standing of the German Medical Association. He does not look up immediately. He's writing in a leather-bound journal, his handwriting small and precise. When he finally raises his eyes, they are blue and entirely empty of recognition. He sees not Zofia, but subject 2847K, female, Polish, category political. Undress, he says in German, completely. This is how it begins, not with sudden violence, but with the calm procedural language of a routine physical, not in a dungeon, but in a room that could pass for any medical facility in any German city. Clean, organised, rational. That is the first horror, that such things happen not in darkness, but under fluorescent light, not in chaos, but with paperwork filed in triplicate. The Holocaust did not unfold in shadows. It unfolded in offices and clinics and laboratories, documented in patient files and research proposals, committed by men who went home each evening to warm dinners and kissed their children. Good night. The Nazi medical establishment did not stumble into atrocity. It walked there deliberately, step by calculated step, paving the road with academic papers and legal precedents. The foundation was laid long before the first concentration camp opened, in the intellectual architecture of eugenics and racial hygiene that infected Western medicine in the early 20th century. Germany, with its legendary universities and Nobel laureates, with its tradition of Wissenschaft, rigorous, systematic knowledge, proved particularly susceptible. By 1933, when Hitler assumed power, German medicine had already spent 2 decades debating the biological threat posed by the disabled, the mentally ill, the genetically inferior. The regime simply transformed academic debate into state policy. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 codified racial hierarchy into law. The law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring authorized forced sterilization. The T4 euthanasia program, launched in 1939, murdered over 70,000 disabled Germans in the name of racial purification. Each step was documented, each victim counted, each procedure refined. German efficiency applied to human destruction, and the men who administered these programs were not sadistic outliers, but respected professionals, doctors, professors, researchers, who published in peer-reviewed journals and attended international conferences. When the concentration camp system expanded after 1939, these doctors followed. They came willingly, attracted by opportunity. In the camps, they would face none of the ethical constraints or legal oversight that limited research in civilian hospitals. Here, they had access to unlimited human subjects who could be used without consent, damaged without consequence, killed without accountability. The camps became laboratories, the prisoners became experimental material, and the doctors became something for which the German language, despite its legendary precision, has no adequate word. Murderer, is insufficient. Verbrecher, criminal, lacks the specific horror. These were men who perverted the entire healing profession, who transformed medicine from a practice of care into an instrument of genocide. By January 1940, when Zofia walks down that carbolic-scented corridor, the system is already fully operational. At Ravensbruck, the largest women's camp in the Nazi system, a medical staff of SS doctors and nurses oversee a population of thousands. They conduct selections, determining who is fit for labour and who will be killed. They perform examinations that are often preludes to sterilisation, infection experiments, or surgical mutilation. They maintain meticulous records of every procedure, every death, every experiment, filing reports that read like parodies of legitimate research. Subject exhibited expected response to trauma, they write, as if torturing a human being is a laboratory protocol. And before each atrocity there is a room, a waiting room, an examination room, a preparation room, spaces designed to obscure what is about to happen, to wrap horror in the language of routine medical care. These rooms are crucial to the machinery of destruction. They provide psychological buffer, a transitional space where victims can still believe they are patients, where perpetrators can still pretend they are doctors. The rooms are theatre sets for a grotesque performance of normality, where mass murder dresses in a white coat and asks you to step on the scale. Dr. Helmut Vetter expected many things when he volunteered for concentration camp service in 1939. He expected career advancement. The SS Medical Corps offered rapid promotion for ambitious young doctors. He expected research opportunities, access to human subjects unavailable in civilian practice. He expected ideological satisfaction, the chance to serve the fatherland by eliminating biological threats to the Aryan race. What he did not expect was the peculiar emotional numbness that would settle over him within months, the way human beings would transform in his perception from persons into objects, specimens, units of experimental data. He had trained at Würzburg, one of Germany's finest medical schools, studying under professors who lectured on racial hygiene with the same authority they brought to anatomy or pathology. He had absorbed the scientific racism of his era without resistance, accepting as medical fact the hierarchy of races, the danger of genetic contamination, the necessity of biological purification. When he joined the SS in 1937, it felt like a natural extension of his medical calling. He would be a physician to the Volkskörper, the body of the nation, cutting away disease, preventing infection, ensuring the health of the German race. His first posting was at Dachau, where he assisted in high-altitude experiments, placing prisoners in decompression chambers to simulate conditions at extreme altitudes, then observing as their lungs hemorrhaged and their brains starved for oxygen. The research was meant to help Luftwaffe pilots. That's what he told himself. That these deaths served a greater purpose, that the suffering of inferior humans advanced the survival of German airmen. The subjects died badly, gasping, convulsing, sometimes regaining consciousness just long enough to understand what was happening to them. Vetter learned to leave the room during the worst of it, to return only when the thrashing stopped and there was a corpse to examine and a data set to record. At Ravensbruck, transferred in late 1939, he expected similar work, controlled experiments, subjects who would die relatively quickly under controlled conditions. Instead, he found himself conducting gynecological examinations that were barely disguised acts of sexual violence, performing forced sterilizations on women deemed racially undesirable, assisting senior doctors in surgical experiments that served no research purpose beyond satisfying the perpetrator's curiosity or cruelty. The work was not clean, it was not scientific, it was simply violence with medical instruments, sadism with paperwork. He began drinking schnapps before certain procedures, not enough to impair his technical skill. His hands remained steady, his incisions precise, but enough to dull the part of his mind that still recognized what he was doing. He developed elaborate mental frameworks to justify his actions. These women were enemies of the Reich. They had forfeited their rights through their crimes. Their suffering, while regrettable, served the greater good of Germany. These were not original thoughts. They were the standard rationalizations provided by Nazi ideology, by SS indoctrination, by the entire apparatus of the regime. But Vetter repeated them to himself with increasing frequency and decreasing conviction, like a prayer whose words have lost all meaning but whose ritual remains necessary. What he truly did not expect was the ordinariness of it all. He had imagined that participating in such things would feel extraordinary, that crossing the boundary from healer to killer would be a dramatic transformation marked by some internal rupture. Instead, it felt like going to work. He woke each morning in his quarters, ate breakfast in the SS mess, walked to the clinic, conducted his examinations, filed his reports, ate lunch, conducted more examinations, filed more reports, had dinner, read for an hour, went to bed. The days acquired a routine. The atrocities became normalized. This perhaps was the most horrifying discovery, that human beings can adapt to anything, can normalize any level of cruelty, can transform monstrous evil into tedious bureaucratic procedure. The female prisoners expected nothing. They had learned, quickly and brutally, that expectations were a luxury they could not afford. When Zofia received her summons to the clinic, a guard calling her number during morning roll call, she felt her stomach drop but kept her face neutral. Around her, other women avoided eye contact. Everyone knew what clinic summons often meant. Not all women returned from the revier, and those who did return were often changed in ways visible and invisible. Limping, bleeding, hollow-eyed, marked by some procedure whose exact nature was spoken of only in whispers after lights out, when darkness provided the illusion of privacy. Zofia had heard the stories about women sterilized without anesthetic, about examinations that lasted hours and left women unable to walk, about experiments, that word whispered with particular horror, where doctors tested drugs or procedures on prisoners as if they were laboratory animals. She had heard about Dr. Vetter specifically, about his cold blue eyes, about the way he touched women as if they were objects, about his meticulous note-taking even as women screamed. She had heard, and she had hoped. The desperate hope of someone trapped in hell that her number would never be called. Now it had been. Now she walked down that corridor toward the white door, and there was nothing to expect except that whatever happened would be worse than her fear of it. That was the lesson the camps taught with brutal efficiency, that human imagination cannot prepare you for the reality of systematic dehumanization, that there is always another depth to which you can be forced to descend. The historical record is precise in its horror. At Ravensbruck between 1939 and 1945, SS doctors conducted forced sterilizations on thousands of women, Roma, Jewish, Polish, any group the regime deemed unworthy of reproduction. They used multiple methods: surgical removal of ovaries, injection of caustic substances into the uterus, exposure to radiation. Many women died from infections or hemorrhaging. Many more survived but were left permanently damaged, their bodies mutilated in the name of racial purity. The doctors kept careful records. Dr. Karl Klauberg, who conducted sterilization experiments at Ravensbruck and later Auschwitz, documented his techniques in detailed medical reports, hoping to publish his findings after the war. He developed a method of sterilization through chemical injection that required only a single procedure and no surgical incision, a technique he believed would allow the Reich to sterilize millions of undesirables cheaply and efficiently. He tested this method on hundreds of women without anesthetic, observing their pain responses, noting complications, refining his procedure. He was not a rogue sadist, but a trained gynecologist with a university position who saw himself as a scientist solving a logistical problem. Dr. Herta Oberhäuser, one of the few female physicians in the SS Medical Corps, conducted her own experiments at Ravensbruck. She infected prisoners with bacteria, deliberately inflicted wounds, tested drugs on women whose reactions she observed with clinical detachment. After the war, she would be convicted at Nuremberg and sentenced to 20 years in prison, though she served only 5. Upon release, she resumed medical practice in Germany, working as a family doctor until a survivor recognized her in 1958 and her license was revoked. For more than a decade after her crimes, she continued to examine patients, to prescribe medications, to present herself as a healer. The examination rooms themselves were designed to facilitate these crimes. They were located in a separate building within the camp, marked with a red cross, the international symbol of medical care perverted into a marker of danger. The rooms were equipped like any medical facility. Examination tables with stirrups, cabinets of instruments, sterilization equipment, filing systems for patient records. This normalcy was intentional. It allowed doctors to maintain the fiction that they were conducting medicine, not torture. It allowed guards and administrators to process the atrocities as medical procedures, not crimes. And it allowed the Nazi state to document everything with bureaucratic precision, creating an archive of atrocity written in the language of clinical research. Women were brought to these rooms in various ways. Some were told they needed routine health checks. Some were informed they had infections requiring treatment. Some were given no explanation at all, simply marched from their barracks to the clinic under guard. Once inside, they were ordered to undress, to sit on the examination table, to place their feet in the stirrups. The ritual of a normal gynecological exam was mimicked in every detail, except that consent was absent, dignity was stripped away, and the examination often involved procedures that had nothing to do with health: sterilization, experimentation, sexual assault dressed as medical necessity. The doctors maintained professional demeanor throughout. They wore white coats, they washed their hands, they used proper medical terminology. Dr. Vetter, examining Zofia in January 1940, would have spoken in the calm, authoritative tone of a physician conducting a routine exam. He would have noted her vital signs, palpated her abdomen, conducted an internal examination with gloved hands and sterile instruments. He would have done everything correctly by the standards of medical procedure, except that Zofia had no say in any of it, no right to refuse, no assurance that the examination would remain within the bounds of legitimate medical practice. This was the particular genius of Nazi medical crimes. They occurred within the framework of normal medicine, using the tools and language and procedures of legitimate healthcare, but emptied entirely of the ethical foundation that makes medicine a healing profession. The Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, was not violated so much as inverted. These doctors deliberately harmed in pursuit of ideological and experimental goals, all while maintaining the external appearance of medical professionalism. The transformation did not happen all at once for Dr. Vetter. There was no single moment when he crossed from doctor to war criminal, no dramatic decision to abandon his medical ethics. Instead, there was a gradual erosion, a series of small compromises that accumulated into monstrous evil. The first time he participated in a forced sterilization, he felt deep discomfort. The woman had cried, had begged in Polish that he couldn't understand but whose meaning was unmistakable. He had paused, scalpel in hand, and for perhaps 30 seconds he had stood on the edge of refusal. Then his superior, Dr. Sontag, had looked at him with irritation and asked if there was a problem. Vetter shook his head and made the first incision. After that it became easier. Not easy. He still drank before certain procedures, still avoided thinking too carefully about what he was doing, but easier. He developed techniques of emotional distancing. He focused on the technical aspects of the work, the precise placement of instruments, the correct dosage of medications. He stopped learning the women's names, referred to them only by prisoner numbers. He stopped looking at their faces during procedures, kept his eyes on the surgical field. He created elaborate intellectual justifications, that he was following orders, that refusing would mean his own punishment or death, that someone else would do these things if he didn't, that his participation at least ensured the procedures were done competently with minimal additional suffering. None of these justifications withstood even minimal ethical scrutiny, and some part of Vetter knew this, but humans are profoundly skilled at self-deception, especially when the alternative is confronting their own complicity in evil. Vetter convinced himself that he was surviving, adapting, doing what was necessary in impossible circumstances. He did not think of himself as a monster. Monsters were aberrations, psychopaths, sadists who enjoyed cruelty. He was none of those things. He was simply a doctor doing his duty in wartime, serving his nation, following the directives of legitimate authority. This belief system, this elaborate scaffold of rationalization, began to crack in the spring of 1943. A woman was brought to his examination room, a political prisoner from Munich, a former schoolteacher arrested for distributing anti-Nazi pamphlets. She was older than most of the prisoners, perhaps 50, and she looked at Vetter with an expression he had learned to ignore in younger women, but found unsettling in her. Not fear, but profound sadness. When he ordered her to undress for a routine examination, she complied without resistance but said quietly in German, "You are someone's son. You are someone's son. How did you become this?" The question lodged in him like shrapnel. He completed the examination, it was routine, no experiment or sterilization scheduled that day, and filed his report. But the woman's words returned to him in quiet moments. How did you become this? He had been raised by loving parents in Stuttgart. His father was a pharmacist, his mother a teacher. They had instilled in him respect for education, reverence for science, compassion for the suffering. They had been proud when he entered medical school, had attended his graduation, had toasted his future as a healer. What would they think if they knew what he did in this place? He told himself they would understand, that they would recognize he had no choice, that they would be proud he served Germany even in these difficult circumstances, but he was no longer certain he believed his own story. By 1944, as Germany's military situation deteriorated and rumours of Soviet advances reached even the isolated world of Ravensbruck, Vetter began to worry about the future. What would happen when the war ended? What would the Allies do with people like him? The Nazi leadership assured them that Germany would triumph, that the camps would be emptied and the prisoners eliminated before any liberating army arrived. But Vetter was trained in observation and data analysis, and the data suggested Germany was losing, which meant someone would eventually come to Ravensbrück, would open the files, would read the clinical reports he had written in his precise handwriting. He began subtly altering his documentation, making his procedures sound more medical and less experimental. He started refusing certain orders when he could do so without obvious insubordination, claiming lack of necessary equipment, suggesting delays, performing examinations without the additional brutalities his superiors sometimes demanded. These were not acts of courage or redemption. They were the calculations of a guilty man beginning to fear judgment. He was not transforming back into a healer. He was simply beginning to understand that atrocity, so normal within the bubble of the camp, might not be viewed as such by the outside world. For the women who survived Ravensbrück's medical crimes, the transformation was different and more profound. They had entered the examination rooms as human beings with bodies that belonged to them, with dignity that was their birthright, with futures that stretched beyond the barbed wire. They emerged as something else, damaged, violated, marked permanently by what had been done to them. Some never spoke of it, carrying the trauma in silence for the rest of their lives. Some testified at war crimes trials, finding in public witnessing a form of healing or at least of meaning-making. All of them carried the knowledge that medicine, which should heal, could instead become an instrument of profound harm, and that doctors, who should protect the vulnerable, could instead become their destroyers. Zofia survived. In April 1945, as the Red Army approached Ravensbrück, she was among the prisoners force-marched westward, in a desperate attempt by the SS to hide evidence of their crimes. She survived that march, was liberated by Soviet forces, eventually made her way back to Poland. She never spoke publicly about the examination rooms, about the procedures conducted on her body, about Dr. Vetter with his blue eyes and steady hands. She married in 1947 a fellow survivor. They never had children, not by choice, she would tell her sister late one night after too much vodka, but because the doctors at Ravensbrück had ensured she could not. She died in 1983, aged 66, and was buried in Warsaw. In her papers, found after her death, was a single page torn from a notebook. On it, in Polish, just 4 words, they called it medicine. There is an object that appears repeatedly in survivor testimonies from Ravensbrück's medical facilities, a clipboard. The doctors always carried clipboards, always took notes during procedures. They recorded measurements, observations, reactions. They filled out forms in triplicate, 1 copy for the camp medical office, 1 for SS headquarters in Berlin, 1 for their own research files. The clipboard represented the Nazi insistence on documentation, the bureaucratic soul of the Holocaust. But for prisoners, it became something else, a symbol of their reduction from person to data point, from human to experimental subject. Survivors remember the sound of pencil on paper while they were examined, while they were violated, while they lay on tables with their bodies exposed and their dignity shattered. They remember doctors who looked more often at their clipboards than at the women they were treating. They remember thinking, even in the midst of pain or fear, about what was being written about them, what clinical language was being used to describe their suffering, how their agony was being transformed into medical notation. The clipboard represented a particular obscenity, the pretense that what was happening was science, that these crimes were research, that inflicting pain and death on unconsenting subjects could be justified by data collection. After the war, when Allied forces discovered the medical records from Ravensbruck and other camps, they found thousands of pages of clinical notes describing experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics. The notes were organized, detailed, professionally formatted. They looked like legitimate research documentation, except that every page described a crime. At the Nuremberg doctors' trial in 1946-1947, prosecutors presented these documents as evidence. They showed clipboards that had been used to record experiments. They read aloud from clinical reports that described, in neutral medical language, procedures that constituted torture and murder. The disconnect between the professional tone of the documentation and the horror of the acts described was profound. Here was a report noting, subject expired at 14:37 hours following administration of experimental compound X147, as if the death of a human being was a minor data point in a research project. Here was a chart tracking pain responses during sterilization procedures conducted without anesthetic, as if measuring women's screams was a legitimate scientific endeavour. The doctors on trial, 23 of them, including several from Ravensbruck, defended themselves by claiming they were advancing medical science, that their research would save lives, that they were following orders, that they were acting within the laws and norms of the Nazi state. Their lawyers argued that the experiments, while regrettable, were no different in principle from research conducted by other nations on prisoners or subjects who couldn't consent. These defences failed. 16 defendants were found guilty. 7 were sentenced to death by hanging. The tribunal established for the first time in the international law clear principles of medical ethics, that research on human subjects requires informed consent, that the potential benefits must justify the risks, that subjects must have the right to withdraw, that researchers have a duty to minimize harm. These principles, formalized in the Nuremberg Code, emerged directly from the horror of Nazi medical crimes. The clipboard, that mundane object, that simple tool of bureaucracy, had become a symbol of medicine perverted, of science corrupted, of the human capacity to rationalize atrocity through the language of professionalism and data collection. April 30th, 1945. Ravensbrück Concentration Camp. The SS has fled. The Red Army is approaching, artillery fire audible in the distance. The camp is in chaos, prisoners emerging from barracks, weak and disoriented, confronting the sudden absence of their captors. Some search for food, some collapse, some wander in shock, unable to process that the daily routine of terror has suddenly ceased. A group of women breaks into the medical facility. They move room to room, seeing for the first time the spaces that some of them were brought to blindly, under guard, never seeing more than the corridor and the examination room where they were held. They find the offices where records were kept. They find cabinets filled with instruments. They find the examination rooms with their tables and stirrups, and the smells of disinfectant failing to mask something darker. One woman, a Czech political prisoner, a resistance fighter, a survivor of multiple examinations, picks up a clipboard from a desk. It still has papers attached. She reads the top page. It's a medical report dated 2 weeks earlier describing a sterilization procedure performed on prisoner 4521J, clinical language, precise measurements, notation of complications. The woman's hands begin to shake. She carries the clipboard outside and throws it on a pile of documents that other prisoners are building in the camp square. Someone produces matches. The pile ignites. They burn everything they can find. Records, reports, files, documents. The smoke rises black and thick into the spring sky. It is not enough, will never be enough, cannot undo what was done. But it is something, a refusal to let the perpetrator's documentation stand as the only record. a rejection of the clinical language that dressed horror in professional terminology. The women watched the papers burn, and in the destruction of those documents, there was a kind of power reclaimed, a small assertion of humanity against the machinery of dehumanization that tried to reduce them to numbers and data points and experimental subjects. But not all the records burn. The SS, anticipating liberation, had already transferred many documents to Berlin. Allied forces sweeping through Germany would discover vast archives in various locations, bunkers, office buildings, abandoned headquarters. The paper trail of Nazi medical crimes survived, became evidence, testimony, historical, record. The meticulous documentation that the perpetrators believed proved their scientific legitimacy instead became the unambiguous evidence of their guilt. Dr. Helmut Vetter fled Ravensbrück in late April 1945 as Soviet forces approached. He discarded his SS uniform, obtained civilian clothes, and attempted to disappear into the chaos of collapsing Germany. He was arrested by British forces in August 1945, identified through the tattoo all SS members bore beneath their left arm, their blood type, a mark that would allow them to receive rapid transfusions if wounded, now became the brand that identified them as members of the organisation that perpetrated genocide. During interrogation, Vetter was initially cooperative, apparently believing that if he presented himself as a professional doing difficult but necessary medical work under orders, he might be treated as a soldier rather than a criminal. He was confused when his interrogators responded with disgust to his clinical descriptions of camp procedures. He seemed genuinely unable to understand why forced sterilizations and medical experiments without consent were being characterized as crimes rather than research. He had so thoroughly absorbed Nazi ideology, had so completely rationalized his actions, that he could not recognize his own monstrosity. He was tried at the Nuremberg doctor's trial. The prosecution presented documentation in his own handwriting. Reports describing sterilizations he performed, experiments he assisted with, examinations he conducted. They presented testimony from survivors who identified him, who described what he did in those examination rooms. Vetter's defense was that he acted under orders, that refusal would have meant his own death, that his participation ensured procedures were conducted with technical competence that minimized suffering. The tribunal found him guilty of crimes against humanity. In their judgment, they noted that following orders is not a defense for participation in atrocities, that medical professionals have ethical obligations that supersede military obedience, that the deliberate infliction of harm on unconsenting subjects is not medicine regardless of how it is documented. He was sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted to 20 years imprisonment. He served 12 years, was released in 1958, and lived quietly in Bavaria until his death from heart failure in 1977. He never publicly recanted, never expressed remorse, never acknowledged that what he did in those examination rooms was anything other than difficult but necessary medical work in wartime. There are no monuments to the women who were brutalized in Ravensbruck's examination rooms, no memorial that specifically names the medical crimes committed there, though the camp itself is preserved as a memorial site. The examination rooms no longer exist. The medical building was demolished years ago, the land now part of the museum complex, but architecturally undifferentiated from the rest. Visitors walk past the site without knowing that beneath their feet are the foundations of rooms where medicine became torture, where the language of healing concealed the practice of harm. But the testimony remains. Survivors left their voices in trial transcripts, in oral history archives, in memoirs written decades after liberation. They spoke, despite trauma and shame, and the difficulty of putting unspeakable experiences into words, because they understood that silence would allow the perpetrator's version of events, clinical, rationalized, documented in professional medical language, to become the only record. They spoke so that the world would know that those examination rooms were not sites of medicine but of violation, that those white-coated doctors were not healers but criminals, that the Holocaust was perpetrated not just by soldiers and guards, but by professionals who should have known better, who did know better, who chose atrocity anyway. Zofia's sister, interviewed by a Polish oral history project in 1979, 2 years before Zofia's death, said this: "She never fully spoke of what happened in that place. But once, when there was news about a doctor somewhere who had been discovered to be one of them, one of the camp doctors, she said to me, 'They called it medicine.' That was all. She said nothing more, but I understood. They dressed horror in white coats and made victims undress for it, and called it examination and treatment and care. They took the language of healing and made it a language of harm, and they got away with it, most of them. They walked away and resumed their lives and practiced medicine and went on as if they had not done these things. That is what she could not forgive. Not just what they did, but that they were never made to see it as the crime it was. This is the final cruelty, that most of the doctors who participated in Nazi medical crimes were never punished, never even identified. Of the thousands of physicians who served in the camp system, who participated in selections, who conducted forced sterilizations and medical experiments and atrocities disguised as healthcare, only a small fraction were ever brought to trial. Most melted back into civilian life after 1945, resumed medical practice, grew old in comfort and respectability. Some were eventually discovered and prosecuted. Dr. Oberhäuser in 1958, Dr. Joseph Mengele hunted until his death in 1979. Others found and tried in scattered proceedings through the 1960s and 1970s. But most were never held accountable. They kept their secrets, or they shared them only with fellow veterans who understood, or they rationalized them into stories of survival and duty. They did not see themselves as criminals, and often died without ever accepting that they were. This is the truth that Zofia understood and carried to her grave, that evil on this scale requires not just monsters, but ordinary people willing to participate, and that such people rarely transform back into moral actors, even after their crimes are exposed. The doctors of Ravensbrück and Auschwitz and Dachau and Buchenwald were not aberrations. They were products of a system that convinced educated professionals that some humans were less human than others, that ideology could justify atrocity, that the state's goals superseded individual rights, that medicine could be practiced without ethics. And after that system collapsed, those same professionals largely continued believing they had done nothing wrong, that they were victims of a historical misunderstanding, that their actions, documented in their own clinical reports, were defensible. Epilogue. There is a question that haunts the history of Nazi medical crimes, a question that survivors asked, and that historians still struggle to answer satisfactorily. How? How did educated professionals trained in healing become perpetrators of systematic torture and murder? How did the violation of every principle of medical ethics become routine? How did examination rooms, spaces that should represent care and healing, become chambers of horror? The answer is not singular or simple. It involves ideology that convinced doctors that some lives were not worth living, that some people were biologically inferior, that the health of the folk justified any individual suffering. It involves a bureaucratic system that fragmented responsibility, that allowed each participant to see themselves as just following orders, just doing their small part, just filling out paperwork or conducting examinations while someone else made the real decisions. It involves the human capacity for rationalization, for normalizing the abnormal, for adjusting to circumstances that should be unthinkable. But beneath all of this is a deeper truth, that the structures meant to protect human dignity, professional ethics, legal systems, institutional oversight, are fragile. They function only as long as people choose to uphold them. When ideology declares that some humans are not fully human, when authority figures order violations of ethics, when collective action creates an environment where atrocity becomes routine, those structures crumble. The doctors at Ravensbruck were not forced to commit crimes at gunpoint. They chose to participate step by step, compromise by compromise, until they were so deep in complicity that they could no longer recognize the boundary they had crossed. The examination rooms where these crimes occurred have been demolished, but their legacy persists. Modern medical ethics, informed consent, the right to refuse treatment, the absolute prohibition on experimentation without consent, emerged directly from the exposure of Nazi medical crimes. The Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, the Belmont Report, these foundational documents of research ethics exist because the Holocaust revealed what happens when medicine operates without ethical constraints. Every time a researcher obtains informed consent, every time an ethics committee reviews a research protocol, every time a doctor respects a patient's autonomy, it is a small victory over the legacy of those examination rooms. But vigilance is required. The impulse that led German doctors to participate in genocide, the belief that ideology can justify atrocity, that some humans are less deserving of rights, that professional competence can be separated from ethical responsibility, did not die with Nazi Germany. It persists wherever medicine is practiced without patient consent, wherever vulnerable populations are used as research subjects without protection, wherever professional authority is used to control rather than heal. The examination rooms of Ravensbrück are gone, but the possibility they represent, that spaces of healing can become spaces of harm, remains as long as we forget that medicine divorced from ethics is not medicine at all. Zofia understood this. In her silence, in her refusal to speak of what was done to her, in those 4 words written on a page and discovered after her death, they called it medicine, she left a testimony more powerful than any clinical report. She named the fundamental crime, not just the violation of her body, but the violation of the trust that should exist between healer and patient, the perversion of the medical profession into an instrument of genocide, the use of scientific language to conceal and justify atrocity. The women who walked down those corridors, who entered those examination rooms, who placed their feet in stirrups and their bodies in the hands of doctors who saw them as objects, these women were not abstractions or statistics. They were humans with names and histories and futures that were stolen from them. They were Zofia and Maria and Anna and thousands of others whose names appear only in the perpetrator's documentation, reduced to prisoner numbers and data points. They deserved care and received violation. They deserved healing and received harm. They deserved the protection of medicine and instead became its victims. This is what must be remembered. Not just that these crimes occurred, but that they occurred within the structure of organized medicine, committed by trained professionals, documented in clinical language, presented as science. The Holocaust was not an interruption of modernity, but a product of it, of industrial efficiency, bureaucratic organization, scientific rationalization applied to mass murder. And the medical crimes were not peripheral to this project, but central, both practically and symbolically. They represented the ultimate perversion of the healing professions, the transformation of doctors from protectors of life into agents of death. In the end, the examination rooms of Ravensbrück were not exceptional spaces of horror, but concentrated expressions of a broader truth. That atrocity on a massive scale requires the participation of ordinary professionals willing to set aside their ethics in service of ideology. The doctors who worked in those rooms were not monsters born to cruelty. They were men and women trained to heal who chose, step by step, to harm instead. That choice and the system that made it possible is what must be remembered and resisted in every generation, in every place where human dignity is threatened and professional ethics are tested. The rooms are gone. The documentation survives. The testimony remains. And the question persists, as urgent now as in 1945. How do we ensure that medicine always heals, that doctors always protect, that the spaces where we are most vulnerable are always spaces of care? The answer lies not in better systems or stronger laws, though those matter, but in the daily choice of individual professionals to uphold their ethical obligations, even when authority demands otherwise, even when ideology justifies violations, even when everyone around them has normalized the abnormal. The women of Ravensbrück, walking barefoot down carbolic-scented corridors toward white doors that opened onto horror, deserved doctors who would refuse to harm them. They deserved a medical profession that would protect them even from the state. They deserved ethics strong enough to resist ideology. They received none of these things. In their memory, we must ensure that such failures never occur again, that the words medical examination never again conceal violation, that white coats never again disguise the perpetrators of atrocity. They called it medicine. 4 words, a testimony, an accusation, a warning that echoes across decades, reminding us that the capacity for such evil is not buried in history, but remains latent wherever human dignity is devalued and professional ethics are compromised. The examination rooms of Ravensbrück were demolished, but their lesson is eternal, that medicine without ethics is not healing but harm, and that the vigilance required to prevent such horrors is not occasional but constant, not historical but present, not collective but individual, a choice made every day by every professional who holds another's life in their hands.